The Priest Who Disappeared at Dawn. Dear listeners, welcome back to Tea Time Mysteries. I'm your host, Henry, and I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from across Asia, these cosy Miss Marple mysteries bring us together. Tonight's story was chosen by our community. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now, pour your tea, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Bells. At daybreak. St. Anselm's bells were never meant to ring at dawn. They were a courteous set of bells, accustomed to waiting for proper hours and proper congregations, chiming for weddings that smelled of roses and funerals heavy with chrysanthemums. Yet on this particular morning in the village of Larkspur End they pealed sharply at 6:30, startling sparrows from the yew trees and rousing the village from its habitual dignified slumber. Miss Jane Marple, already awake, paused in the careful act of threading her needle. She sat by the front window of her neat cottage, the pale morning light revealing the exacting order of her sitting room. Antimacassars laid just so, a vase of late summer asters, and a half-finished piece of embroidery depicting a robin perched upon a gate. She tilted her head slightly, listening, the way one did when a familiar sound behaved in an unfamiliar manner. "That is very odd," she murmured. Ordinarily, the bells rang at 8 for matins, rung by young Simon Price, who never hurried and never rang twice alike. These bells, however, were hurried, uneven, pulled by someone anxious or unskilled. Miss Marple set aside her needle and rose, peering out across the dew-bright lane toward the church spire rising above the rooftops. Within minutes, footsteps hurried past her gate. Curtains twitched, doors opened. Larkspur End, which prided itself on its composure, was awake and murmuring. By the time Miss Marple reached the green, the village had already begun to assemble in small, tight knots. Mrs. Eliza Hardwick, formidable in a hat entirely unsuitable for so early an hour, was whispering fiercely to Mrs. Bellamy from the post office. Young mothers hovered near prams, eyes bright with alarm and excitement in equal measure. Even Colonel Whitcomb, retired and opinionated, stood with his stick planted firmly before him, as though bracing himself against something unseen. At the church gate stood Inspector James Caldwell of the county police, his expression set in a careful mask of authority. Behind him, the heavy oak doors of St. Anselm's yawned open. Miss Marple approached quietly, her sensible shoes barely whispering on the gravel. "Morning, Miss Marple," said Inspector Caldwell with polite respect. He had learned, as many had, that ignoring her was a mistake. "I'm afraid there's been an incident." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I should think there has." The church interior was cool and dim. Candles guttered on the altar, burned low as if left unattended for hours. The air carried the faint scent of incense and something else. Stale, perhaps, or disturbed. "What seems to be the trouble?" Miss Marple asked, folding her hands in front of her. Inspector Caldwell hesitated. "Reverend Edwin Hawthorne has not been seen since yesterday evening." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "That is unusual. He is a punctual man." "Indeed. He was expected to conduct early prayers this morning. When the verger arrived and found the vestry empty and the bells untouched, he rang them himself to raise the alarm." "And Reverend Hawthorne?" Miss Marple prompted. "His rooms are empty, bed unslept in." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then he did not retire there at all." Caldwell looked at her sharply. "So it would seem. Reverend Edwin Hawthorne had come to Larkspur End 3 years earlier, a widower with mild manners and a voice that soothed rather than stirred. He was liked, though Miss Marple, who distinguished carefully between liking and understanding, had noticed certain quiet tensions that followed him like a shadow. The village reacted to the news in its own efficient way. By 10 o'clock, speculation had hardened into theories. Mrs. Hardwick was convinced the Reverend had run off with a woman. Men of the cloth are no different, mark my words. Colonel Whitcomb suspected blackmail. The schoolmistress, Miss Dora Finch, spoke gravely of a breakdown brought on by overwork. Everyone spoke at once, and everyone spoke with certainty. Miss Marple listened. She listened at the baker's shop, where Mrs. Bellamy lowered her voice to a conspiratorial hiss. She listened on the green, where young Simon Price insisted he had seen a light in the vestry at dawn. She listened at luncheon, where her niece's former governess, now settled nearby, insisted that Reverend Hawthorne had been unhappy lately. "And what does unhappiness look like?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Well, quiet," said the governess, uncertainly. Miss Marple smiled. Quiet, she thought, could mean many things. By afternoon, Inspector Caldwell had established a temporary office in the vicarage study. He questioned villagers methodically, jotting notes, frowning now and again. The absence of any sign of struggle reassured him. Disappearances, he believed, were more often voluntary than sinister. Yet Miss Marple found herself thinking of something Reverend Hawthorne had said the previous week during the village fete. He had stood beside her near the cake stall, watching children dart about with sticky fingers. "Larkspur End is very peaceful," he had said, with a curious emphasis. "Almost too peaceful." "Appearances are always comforting," Miss Marple had replied. "Reality is rather more untidy." At the time, he had smiled, but his eyes had not. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the church bells remained silent, a cry went up from the river path. It was young Simon Price again, breathless and pale, who burst into the village square shouting for the police. They found Reverend Hawthorne's hat first, floating gently near the reeds, its brim soaked and misshapen. A few yards further on, tangled in the rushes, lay his body. The villagers stood at a distance, hushed now, the thrill of gossip stilled by the undeniable weight of death. Inspector Caldwell removed his hat. "He didn't drown," he said quietly. "Not exactly." Miss Marple did not move closer. She did not need to. Instead, she watched the faces of the villagers, the sudden shock, the swift calculations, the relief in some, the fear in others. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. As the first stars pricked the sky above Larkspur End, the village understood that it was no longer merely missing its priest, it had acquired a murder. Chapter 2: Whispers After Evensong. By the following morning, Larkspur End had recovered just enough composure to begin behaving badly. The news of Reverend Hawthorne's death, now spoken of plainly as murder, despite Inspector Caldwell's careful avoidance of the word, spread with astonishing efficiency. It slipped under doors with the milk bottles, rose with the steam from kettles, and settled firmly into every conversation, no matter how it began. Miss Marple, taking her customary morning walk, observed the transformation with mild interest. The village wore a collective expression of shocked propriety, rather like a congregation that has discovered the vicar's sermon notes contained something improper. Grief was present, certainly, but so was something else: excitement, sharpened by fear. At the post office, Mrs. Bellamy leaned forward over the counter, her voice lowered to what she clearly believed was an inaudible whisper. "They say he was struck first," she said. "Hit on the back of the head. That doesn't happen by accident, does it?" Miss Marple purchased her stamps and nodded sympathetically. "People do trip in the most unexpected places." Mrs. Bellamy looked disappointed. "Well, I don't believe it. Not for a moment." No, Miss Marple thought. You wouldn't. Outside, Colonel Whitcomb had installed himself on a bench near the green, dispensing opinions to anyone within earshot. "A cowardly business," he declared. "Someone who knew the place. Rivers don't just invite strangers, you know." "Most things don't," said Miss Marple mildly, pausing beside him. He sniffed. "I suppose you'll say it's all very sad." "Very," she agreed, "and very revealing." Colonel Whitcomb blinked. Revealing of what? Of how people behave when they think no one is watching. She moved on before he could pursue the point. Inspector Caldwell had worked late into the night. By mid-morning, he had compiled a neat list of those who had seen Reverend Hawthorne in his final hours. The list was not short, which irritated him. Larkspur End was the sort of place where everyone noticed everyone else, yet clarity remained elusive. The Reverend had attended the church council meeting at 6 o'clock. He had shared a modest supper with Miss Dora Finch afterward, purely, she emphasised, to discuss hymn selections for Harvest Festival. He had spoken briefly with Simon Price while locking up the church, and then, apparently, he had vanished. "What I can't understand," Caldwell muttered to Miss Marple, "is why no one heard anything. No shout, no disturbance." "No one ever does," Miss Marple said, "not when they are busy minding their own business." The body had been examined and removed, leaving behind only the quiet curve of the river and a sense of violation that made even the birds seem subdued. Caldwell suspected a straightforward case: a quarrel, a push, perhaps an attempt to stage an accident. "The obvious suspect," he said, "is someone close to him." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it usually is." and Miss Dora Finch was the last person known to dine with him. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Miss Finch is devoted to routine. She would find murder most inconvenient. Caldwell smiled thinly. That doesn't make her innocent. No, Miss Marple agreed, but it makes her predictable. Predictability, Miss Marple knew, was a valuable thing. People who behaved according to type were rarely the most interesting suspects. The village gathered that afternoon in the church hall, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for Sunday services, but in truth to assess one another. The absence of Reverend Hawthorne was a presence in itself, hanging heavily over the trestle tables and cups of untouched tea. Mrs. Hardwicke presided with grim efficiency. "We must show unity," she said. "Outsiders will be watching." "Outsiders always do," murmured Miss Marple. Miss Finch sat stiffly at the far end, her hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. When questions arose about her supper with the Reverend, she answered calmly, if a little too carefully. He was preoccupied, she said. Troubled by something. He spoke of burdens. "Did he say what sort?" Mrs. Hardwicke pressed. "No," Miss Finch replied, "only that they had been long carried." Miss Marple noted the phrasing. It sounded rehearsed. Simon Price hovered near the door, clearly eager to contribute something of importance. "I saw a light in the vestry," he repeated. "Early, before the bells." "And you rang them because of that?" Inspector Caldwell asked. "Well, yes. I thought maybe he'd overslept, or fallen ill." Miss Marple looked at the boy kindly. "And did you go inside?" Simon flushed. "No, miss. I thought it best to fetch help." A sensible boy, Miss Marple thought, or a frightened one. As the meeting broke up, small conversations sprang up like weeds. Miss Marple drifted from one to another, collecting fragments. Someone mentioned that Reverend Hawthorne had received letters, unusual ones, delivered privately. Someone else recalled a disagreement with Colonel Whitcomb over the sale of a strip of church land. Mrs. Bellamy hinted darkly at money troubles. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, to no one in particular, "he gave generously to the church roof fund." That evening, Inspector Caldwell visited Miss Marple at her cottage. He accepted a cup of tea and one of her scones, praising both with sincerity. "I'm not sure why I'm telling you this," he said at last, "but something doesn't sit right." "Things rarely do when one looks closely," she replied. "He wasn't robbed. His watch and wallet were still on him. And the blow, well, it was precise. Controlled." "Like a reprimand," Miss Marple suggested. Caldwell frowned. "You think it was personal?" "I think," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea, "that Reverend Hawthorne knew something, and someone knew that he knew it." Outside, the church bells remained silent, their ropes hanging slack in the tower. Miss Marple gazed toward the darkened spire. "In villages," she said gently, "secrets don't disappear. They only change hands." Inspector Caldwell finished his tea, unaware that somewhere in Larkspur End the real story had already begun to surface, quietly, patiently, waiting to be noticed. Chapter 3. The Shape of Silence. Larkspur End woke beneath a pall of determined normality. Windows were opened at their usual hours, doorsteps swept with slightly more vigour than necessary, and greetings exchanged with exaggerated cheerfulness. It was as though the village believed that if it behaved precisely as it always had, the previous day's events might politely withdraw themselves. Miss Marple, however, noticed the silences. They fell at odd moments, between sentences after names were mentioned, whenever the conversation drifted too near Reverend Hawthorne. Silence, Miss Marple knew, had a shape, and in Larkspur End it was beginning to look crowded. Inspector Caldwell continued his inquiries with steady patience. He had abandoned hope of dramatic revelations and instead focused on routine, which he trusted. Routine, in his experience, eventually tripped people up. Miss Dora Finch was first that morning. She received him in her neat little sitting room, every object aligned with precise symmetry. The curtains were drawn back exactly the same distance on either side, and the clock on the mantel ticked with officious regularity. "You dined with the Reverend," Caldwell said, notebook open. "You've told me that." "Yes," Miss Finch replied. "At 6:30. Cold ham and salad. He ate very little." "Did he seem upset?" She hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. "He seemed resolved." "Resolved about what?" "I couldn't say." Miss Marple, invited to sit in on the conversation at Caldwell's discreet request, observed Miss Finch's hands. They were folded tightly, knuckles pale. People are often resolved, Miss Marple said gently, when they've decided to do something unpleasant. Miss Finch's mouth tightened. I wouldn't know. After Caldwell left, Miss Marple lingered for a moment. You did nothing wrong, she said kindly. Miss Finch's eyes flickered up. That's easy for you to say. Miss Marple smiled. I've said it to many people. Sometimes it's even true. Outside, Simon Price was practicing bell ringing under supervision. The sound echoed hollowly, uncertain. He stopped when he saw Miss Marple. Did I do right? He asked suddenly. In ringing the bells? Miss Marple asked. In telling them about the light? Miss Marple considered him. You told the truth as you understood it. That doesn't mean it helped, Simon said miserably. No, she agreed. Truth rarely knows what it's doing. The vestry itself had been examined thoroughly, yielding very little. No signs of struggle, no foreign footprints, only Reverend Hawthorne's coat neatly hung and his Bible left open on the desk. Miss Marple stood before the open pages. He was reading Psalms, she said. Caldwell glanced at the text. Comforting, isn't it? Sometimes, Miss Marple replied, sometimes admonishing. The river path, too, offered little. The spot where the body had been found showed signs of disturbance, but nothing that spoke clearly of how the Reverend had come to be there. Caldwell suspected he had been lured. A meeting, he suggested. Someone he trusted. Trust, said Miss Marple, is a dangerous habit. That afternoon, Colonel Whitcomb requested an interview. I won't have it said I avoided you, he declared, planting himself in Caldwell's chair. The Reverend and I had words, yes, but nothing more. About the land? Caldwell asked. About principle, Whitcomb snapped. He objected to my proposal for a memorial pavilion, claimed it wasn't in keeping with the church's values. And how did you respond? I told him values didn't keep the rain off. Miss Marple tilted her head. And did that anger him? Whitcomb hesitated. He was firm, more than usual. Firm. Miss Marple stored the word away. As the day wore on, a subtle shift occurred. People began to notice not just what was said, but what was avoided. Certain names never surfaced. Certain topics were redirected with nervous laughter. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Hardwick, who spoke at length about the importance of propriety. We mustn't speculate, Mrs. Hardwick said. It does no good. Speculation is often unkind, Miss Marple agreed. But it is also honest, Mrs. Hardwick stiffened. I don't see what you mean. Miss Marple smiled. I rarely do at first. That evening, Inspector Caldwell received a small but troubling piece of information. One of the Reverend's private letters, mentioned by more than one villager, was missing. Burned, perhaps, Caldwell suggested. Or removed, Miss Marple said. By whom? By someone who thought it dangerous, she replied, or valuable. The letter, whatever it contained, had not been found among the Reverend's effects, nor had it been delivered to the police. Miss Marple sat by her window that night, watching the moon cast a pale path across the lane. She thought of Reverend Hawthorne's careful manners, his sudden firmness, the light in the vestry at dawn. Silence, she reflected, was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something people were afraid to name, and in Larkspur End, fear was beginning to speak very clearly indeed. Chapter 4. Patterns at Tea. Miss Marple had long maintained that nothing of real importance was ever revealed in formal interviews. Truth, like cream, had a habit of rising naturally to the surface, particularly over teacups. Accordingly, she invited several villagers to her cottage that afternoon, under the entirely respectable pretext of discussing arrangements for the upcoming harvest festival. In Larkspur End, such an invitation was both unremarkable and irresistible. Mrs. Hardwick arrived first, armed with a notebook and a determined expression. Miss Dora Finch followed, pale but composed. Colonel Whitcomb came third, thumping his stick against the step with unnecessary vigour. Simon Price hovered awkwardly at the doorway until Miss Marple insisted he come in as well. They settled into chairs arranged with deceptive casualness. Tea was poured, scones were passed, conversation began precisely where Miss Marple intended it to, safely. The flowers, Mrs. Hardwick said briskly, will need to be arranged earlier this year. Earlier things often reveal themselves better, Miss Marple agreed. Miss Finch's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. Colonel Whitcomb cleared his throat. I still don't see why we're meeting like this. Miss Marple smiled at him benignly. because talking together is so much more efficient than talking apart. There was a brief silence, one of the new crowded ones Miss Marple had begun to recognise. "It's dreadful," Mrs. Hardwick said at last. "What has happened? A clergyman. One expects better." "One always does," Miss Marple replied, "until one learns otherwise." Simon shifted in his seat. "They keep asking me about the light. And quite right too," Miss Marple said kindly. "Light is very important." Inspector Caldwell, arriving just as the teapot was replenished, observed the group with faint amusement. He had learned that Miss Marple's teas were rarely social. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied. "You are just in time." The conversation drifted as Miss Marple guided it toward Reverend Hawthorne's habits, what time he kept, where he walked, whom he favoured with confidences. "He was fond of evening walks," Miss Finch said quietly, "often alone." "He liked the river," Simon added. "Said it helped him think," Colonel Whitcomb snorted. "Thinking is overrated." Miss Marple watched him over the rim of her teacup. "And yet so many people attempt it in secret." Mrs. B. Hardwick spoke sharply. "If you are implying—" "I am merely observing," Miss Marple said. Inspector Caldwell leaned back slightly. "There is one thing I should mention," he said. The medical examiner confirmed the Reverend was struck before being placed in the water. The blow was delivered with something narrow and firm. "A stick?" Simon asked, eyes wide. "Possibly," Caldwell said. "Or something similar." Colonel Whitcomb's hand tightened on his own stick, then relaxed. Miss Marple noticed. After tea, as the others departed, Miss Marple detained Inspector Caldwell. "You see the pattern?" she said. "I see several," Caldwell replied. "That's the trouble." "People reveal themselves most clearly when they think they're discussing something else," Miss Marple said. "Colonel Whitcomb is angry, but his anger is old and familiar. Miss Finch is frightened, but fear makes her careful. Mrs. Hardwick wishes to control the narrative." "And Simon?" Caldwell asked. Miss Marple smiled. "Simon wishes to be helpful, a dangerous desire sometimes." That evening Caldwell received confirmation of something Miss Marple had quietly suspected. Reverend Hawthorne's financial records showed a recent, unexplained withdrawal, small but deliberate. "Blackmail?" Caldwell suggested. "Or hush money," Miss Marple replied, though one must ask, hush money for whom? The next day brought rain, steady and insistent. Larkspur End retreated indoors and secrets followed. Miss Marple called on Mrs. Bellamy at the post office ostensibly to collect a parcel. "Such a shame," Mrs. Bellamy said, leaning forward eagerly. "I always thought the Reverend was, well, too good." "Too good is a heavy burden," Miss Marple agreed. "One must constantly live up to it." Mrs. Bellamy's eyes glittered. "There were rumours, you know, about before he came here." "Rumours are like feathers," Miss Marple said. "Very light, but they stick to everything." That afternoon, Inspector Caldwell made a discovery that pleased him rather too much. Reverend Hawthorne's watch, though found on his person, had stopped at 5:40 a.m. "Time of the attack," Caldwell said. "Or time of the struggle," Miss Marple corrected. "Watches are sensitive creatures." The dawn hour took on new significance. Who, Miss Marple wondered, was awake and abroad at that time? Simon Price, certainly. Colonel Whitcomb, an early riser. Miss Finch, perhaps. Teachers often kept strict schedules. Mrs. Hardwick claimed to sleep late, but Miss Marple had observed her lights burning before sunrise more than once. Patterns, Miss Marple reflected, were rarely about what happened once. They were about what happened always. That night, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple paused over her embroidery. She had stitched the robin's eye slightly too dark, and now it seemed to watch her with undue intensity. Reverend Hawthorne had been struck down at dawn, near a river he loved, after reading admonitory psalms and withdrawing money in secret. He had grown firmer, more resolved, and, Miss Marple suspected, more dangerous. "To someone," she murmured. Outside, rain pattered against the window, blurring the village into soft shapes. Somewhere within those shapes was the person who had decided that silence was safer than truth. Miss Marple threaded her needle again, quite certain that before long that person would make a mistake. Chapter 5. The obvious explanation. Inspector Caldwell awoke that morning with the uncomfortable conviction that the case was beginning to explain itself. This, in his experience, was usually a bad sign. The rain had washed Larkspur End clean overnight, leaving the village deceptively fresh. Sunlight struck the wet pavements, and the church spire gleamed with almost aggressive innocence. Caldwell paused outside St. Anselm's, glancing toward the river path beyond the trees. Everything looked orderly again. Too orderly. The evidence, however, was arranging itself into a shape that the police understood very well. By mid-morning, Caldwell had enough to justify what he privately referred to as progress. Miss Dora Finch had been alone with Reverend Hawthorne shortly before his disappearance. She admitted he had been troubled. She had no alibi after 7 o'clock, and she possessed, in her umbrella stand, a narrow, metal-tipped walking stick, quite suitable, the constable noted helpfully, for delivering a firm blow. "It is always someone sensible," Caldwell said to Miss Marple later, with a trace of regret. "People don't like that, but it's true." Miss Marple was darning a sock. "People like explanations that end conversations." Miss Finch received the news with quiet dignity. "I expected this," she said. When Caldwell informed her she was considered a suspect. "One always looks to the woman who was last alone with the victim." "That doesn't mean you're guilty," Caldwell said. "No," Miss Finch replied. "But it means you're finished looking." Miss Marple, watching closely, noticed something peculiar. Not fear, nor outrage, but relief. Miss Finch seemed almost comforted by the weight of suspicion, as though it had given shape to something previously unbearable. That afternoon, gossip hardened into certainty. "Of course it was Miss Finch," Mrs. Bellamy said, with a sigh that contained more satisfaction than sorrow. "She was devoted to him. Those sorts of attachments go wrong," Colonel Whitcomb nodded grimly. "Always do." Miss Marple listened from the edge of the green, her face composed. "The obvious explanation," she murmured, "is usually the laziest." Inspector Caldwell pressed on. He had ordered a closer examination of Miss Finch's walking stick, and dispatched a constable to inquire discreetly into her past. The county office responded quickly. Nothing scandalous, nothing criminal, a long career in teaching, quiet habits, no known entanglements. "It's thin," Caldwell admitted to Miss Marple that evening, "but thin cases are still cases." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and thin ice can still break." What troubled her was not the evidence itself, but its neatness. Life, she had observed, was rarely neat. Crimes born of emotion tended to sprawl, to leave traces of haste or carelessness. This case, by contrast, seemed to have been tidied. She took an evening walk, letting her feet guide her along familiar paths. Near the river bend, she paused. The water moved smoothly now, betraying nothing of the violence it had witnessed. Miss Marple studied the bank. Reverend Hawthorne had been struck somewhere else. Of that she was certain. The river was an ending, not a beginning. "Endings are easier to manage," she said softly. The next morning brought a development Inspector Caldwell could not ignore. A villager, Mrs. Hardwick's cousin, visiting from the neighbouring town, reported seeing someone near the river shortly before dawn on the morning of the murder. "A woman," she said. "Medium height, sensible shoes." "Could be anyone," Caldwell said, rubbing his temples. "But it sounds like Miss Finch," the constable said. Yes, Caldwell thought. It did. Miss Finch was questioned again. She answered steadily, if wearily. "I did not go to the river," she said. "I went home. I read for a while. I slept badly." "Anyone see you?" Caldwell asked. "No." Miss Marple noticed that Miss Finch did not embellish. She offered no unnecessary detail, no dramatic denial. When Caldwell left, Miss Marple lingered. "Have you ever been accused before?" she asked gently. "No," Miss Finch said. "But I have taught children. One learns that being innocent and being believed are separate skills." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Very true. As the day progressed, the villagers' mood shifted perceptibly. Suspicion had found a home, and with it came relief. People spoke more freely again, their fear softened by direction. Miss Marple found this far more alarming than the suspicion itself. That afternoon, she paid a call on Colonel Whitcomb. He received her with bluff courtesy, offering a chair and a glass of sherry. "Looks like they've got their culprit," he said. "Do you think so?" Miss Marple asked. "Miss Finch fits," he replied. "Devoted woman, disappointment, anger, happens all the time." Miss Marple sipped her sherry. "You sound very certain," he shrugged. "Certainty is comforting." "Indeed," she said, "but comfort is not the same as truth." She rose to leave, then paused. "Colonel, may I ask what time you rise in the mornings?" He blinked. 5:30, army habit. And on the morning Reverend Hawthorne died? Same as always, Miss Marple nodded. Routine is very revealing. That evening, Inspector Caldwell received word that Miss Finch's walking stick bore a faint mark consistent with impact. Nothing conclusive, but enough to justify holding her for further questioning. It's done, Caldwell said heavily. Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she asked, Have you examined the church bell rope? Caldwell looked at her blankly. The rope? It was rung unusually that morning, she said, by someone anxious or practiced. Caldwell sighed. Miss Marple, humour me. The rope was examined. The knot at its end was unfamiliar, not Simon Price's work. That's odd, Caldwell admitted. Miss Marple smiled to herself. That night, as Larkspur End settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. She thought of Miss Finch's relief, Colonel Whitcomb's certainty, Mrs. Hardwick's control. The village had accepted its explanation, which meant Miss Marple knew that the real story was still waiting, quietly, patiently, for someone to listen just a little longer. Chapter 6. The Second Disturbance. The arrest of Miss Dora Finch should have settled Larkspur End. Instead, it unsettled it profoundly. On the surface, the village resumed its routines with renewed enthusiasm. There was a culprit, a narrative, and the comforting sense that tragedy had been neatly contained. Yet beneath this orderly facade, tension hummed like a wire pulled too tight. Miss Marple sensed it immediately. People avoided her eyes now. Conversations faltered when she approached, as though she were a reminder of questions better left unasked. Only Mrs. Bellamy seemed invigorated, dispensing updates from the post office with relish. They say Miss Finch confessed. Well, nearly, she whispered. Nearly is a very large word, Miss Marple replied. Inspector Caldwell, for his part, remained uneasy. He visited Miss Marple that afternoon, his usual composure frayed. I don't like it, he said abruptly, declining tea. She's too calm, too resigned. Resignation, Miss Marple said, often comes from exhaustion, not guilt. Before Caldwell could respond, a constable arrived at the door, breathless. Sir, he said, there's been another incident. That, Miss Marple reflected, was how such things always began. The disturbance was at St. Anselm's. The church doors stood open once more, just as they had on the morning Reverend Hawthorne was discovered missing. Inside, the pews lay in orderly rows, but the vestry was in disarray. Drawers had been pulled out and emptied. Books lay scattered across the desk. The open Bible had been replaced on the shelf, its pages closed with deliberate care. What exactly is missing? Caldwell asked. Nothing obvious, the constable replied, but someone's been looking for something. Miss Marple stepped carefully into the vestry, her gaze moving methodically. Not someone, she said. The same someone. Caldwell frowned. You're certain? Yes, Miss Marple replied. They tidied the Bible this time. Last time, they left it open. That suggests familiarity and urgency. Miss Finch could have come back, Caldwell said slowly. She could, Miss Marple agreed, but she's been in custody all night. That fact hung heavily in the air. The search had been thorough but oddly selective. Financial records were untouched. Personal letters lay undisturbed, except one drawer, now conspicuously empty. The missing letter, Caldwell said. Or letters, Miss Marple corrected. People rarely write just once. By evening, Caldwell had released a statement. The vestry had been vandalised by an unknown person, motive unclear. The village responded with renewed alarm. This proves Miss Finch was involved with something improper, Mrs. Hardwick declared. Why else would anyone interfere? Miss Marple listened without comment. Later, she paid a visit to Simon Price. He answered the door with the wary expression of someone who had been questioned once too often. May I come in? Miss Marple asked. Simon nodded. His sitting room was cluttered with bell-ringing manuals and half-finished mugs of tea. Miss Marple noticed a coil of rope in the corner. Do you practice at home? She asked. Sometimes, Simon said. Helps me get the knots right. Ah, Miss Marple said. Knots are very personal things. Simon flushed. I suppose. Miss Marple smiled gently. You rang the bells that morning with great urgency. I was frightened, Simon said. Of what? Simon hesitated. Of what I might find. Miss Marple did not press him further. The next morning, Inspector Caldwell received forensic confirmation that chilled him. The blow that killed Reverend Hawthorne had been delivered by someone standing slightly behind and to the left, a position suggesting familiarity and trust. He didn't see it coming, Caldwell said. People rarely do, Miss Marple replied, when they think they are safe. That afternoon a note was found pushed through the church door. Stop asking questions. Caldwell stared at it. A threat. A plea, Miss Marple said softly, from someone who has already benefited from our silence. The handwriting was neat, careful, and entirely unhelpful. What do we do now? Caldwell asked. We listen, Miss Marple replied, and we watch for the person who becomes most anxious when we do. That person, she suspected, would soon reveal themselves, for secrets like pressure always sought release, and in Larkspur End something was about to give. Chapter 7. A small, unimportant thing. Miss Marple often said that the most dangerous words in any investigation were, "That doesn't matter." They were spoken again and again in Larkspur End over the next 2 days, usually accompanied by a dismissive wave of the hand and a desire to return to safer topics. The threatening note was explained away as a prank. The disturbance in the vestry was attributed to nerves. Miss Dora Finch remained in custody, quiet and compliant, and the village clung to this fragile arrangement with visible relief. Only Inspector Caldwell appeared unable to rest. I feel as though I'm walking past something, he confessed to Miss Marple one afternoon, and turning my head at the last moment. That is often because you're looking for something large, Miss Marple replied, whereas the truth is frequently quite small. They were standing in the churchyard. The rain had softened the ground, and Caldwell noticed fresh impressions in the earth near the vestry wall. Footprints? He asked, crouching. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, or perhaps only the church cat. Caldwell straightened, faintly irritated. You're certain the vestry disturbance is important? Very, Miss Marple said, because it was unnecessary. He stared at her. Unnecessary. If Miss Finch were guilty, Miss Marple explained patiently, and already under suspicion, there would be no need to risk further attention. Yet someone did, which suggests they were not protecting her, but themselves. Caldwell absorbed this in silence. They entered the church, where the air still carried the faint chill of stone and polish. Miss Marple moved slowly, almost reverently, as though she were there for prayer rather than observation. May I see the bell tower again? She asked. Caldwell nodded and followed her up the narrow staircase. At the top, sunlight filtered through the slats, illuminating the great bells and their ropes. Miss Marple approached the rope Simon Price had used that morning. The one Caldwell now knew bore an unfamiliar knot. She touched it lightly. A clove hitch, she said. Neatly done. Caldwell frowned. Is that unusual? Simon uses a sailor's knot, Miss Marple replied. He showed me once. Very proud of it. Caldwell's eyes sharpened. So someone else rang the bells? Yes, said Miss Marple, someone who knew how. They descended in thoughtful silence. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Hardwick. Mrs. Hardwick received her stiffly, as though bracing herself against criticism. I do hope, she said, that all this unpleasantness will soon be over. It will, Miss Marple said, one way or another. Mrs. Hardwick smiled thinly. Miss Finch has always been odd, too private. Privacy is not a crime, Miss Marple replied, though it is often confused with one. They spoke of the harvest festival, of arrangements and flowers, of appearances. Mrs. Hardwick talked at length, saying very little. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused. Mrs. Hardwick, she said gently, you were awake very early on the morning Reverend Hawthorne died. Mrs. Hardwick stiffened. Yes, I often am. And you looked out of your window? Yes, she said sharply. Everyone did once the bells rang. Miss Marple nodded. Did you notice whether the vestry light was on before the bells? Mrs. Hardwick hesitated. I couldn't say. That's a pity, Miss Marple said. It might have told us who wanted to be discovered. Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly home, her thoughts arranged with quiet satisfaction. The next small, unimportant thing came from an unexpected source. Simon Price appeared at her gate that evening, pale and agitated. I shouldn't be here, he said. They told me not to talk. Who did? Miss Marple asked. Simon swallowed. I can't say. Miss Marple opened the gate wider. You may come in. They sat in her sitting room, the lamplight warm and steady. "I didn't ring the bells that morning," Simon said suddenly. "Not first." Miss Marple waited. "I went to the church because I saw the light, but when I got there, the bells had already been rung, just once, hard." "And then?" Miss Marple asked. "And then I rang them properly," Simon said miserably. "I thought I was late." Miss Marple nodded. "And you didn't tell Inspector Caldwell?" "I thought they'd think I was lying," Simon said. "Or worse." "People often do," Miss Marple said kindly. "But truth has a way of surviving misunderstanding." "Who rang them first?" Simon whispered. Miss Marple met his eyes. "Someone who wanted the village awake. Someone who wanted Reverend Hawthorne found," Simon stared at her. "But why?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "they had made a mistake." She escorted Simon to the door and watched him go with thoughtful concern. The following morning, Miss Marple visited Inspector Caldwell. "You were right," he said at once. "Miss Finch isn't our murderer." "I know," Miss Marple said, "but she's protecting someone." Caldwell frowned. "Protecting whom?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "Tell me, has Miss Finch asked after anyone since her arrest?" Caldwell hesitated. "Yes, Colonel Whitcomb." Miss Marple nodded. "She taught his children, you know. Loyalty like that doesn't disappear." Caldwell stiffened. "Whitcomb had motive. He was angry with Hawthorne." "Anger is common," Miss Marple said. "Murder is not." "But he's strong. He carries a stick." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And he rises early." The pieces were beginning to align. That afternoon, Caldwell confronted Colonel Whitcomb again, this time with sharper questions. Whitcomb bristled but answered. He had been awake. He had walked. He had heard the bells. "And before they rang?" Caldwell pressed. Whitcomb hesitated. "I don't recall." That was enough. Miss Marple, watching from the side, noticed something else entirely. When Caldwell mentioned the missing letters, Whitcomb's gaze flicked involuntarily toward the window, as though measuring distance to the river path. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and resumed her embroidery. She unpicked a small section she had stitched incorrectly, a minor flaw, barely visible, but enough to distort the whole picture. Reverend Hawthorne, she reflected, had done the same. He had seen something wrong and decided at last to correct it. Someone else had decided that was far too dangerous. The pattern was clear now. One final thread remained to be drawn tight. And Miss Marple, with gentle patience, prepared to do exactly that. Chapter 8. The Psychological Game. Miss. Marple had always found that when one wished to see clearly, it was best to encourage others to speak freely, especially those who believed they had already been understood. She set her plan in motion with characteristic simplicity. The Harvest Festival, postponed out of respect for recent events, was reinstated with quiet determination. Mrs. Hardwick announced it as a gesture of resilience. Colonel Whitcomb supported it loudly. Inspector Caldwell approved it reluctantly, reasoning that criminals rarely enjoyed public gatherings. Miss Marple approved of it wholeheartedly. The church hall was filled once more with flowers, preserves, and the polite bustle of village life. Tables were laid out with deceptive cheerfulness. Conversation flowed again, though now it carried an undertone of caution, like a river whose depth one no longer trusted. Miss Dora Finch was released from custody that morning, pending further inquiries. She arrived quietly, her face pale but composed, taking her place behind the bookstall without comment. Colonel Whitcomb watched her with narrowed eyes. Miss Marple noticed. She drifted among the stalls, exchanging pleasantries, accepting compliments on her jam, all the while observing. Colonel Whitcomb was restless. He lingered near the door, his stick tapping against the floor in an irregular rhythm. Mrs. Hardwick hovered protectively near him, as though guarding something fragile. Inspector Caldwell stood back, watching Miss Marple with the wary respect of a man who knew he was no longer directing events. Miss Marple approached Colonel Whitcomb at precisely the moment he was least prepared. "Colonel," she said pleasantly, "I was hoping you might advise me." Whitcomb stiffened. "On what?" "On matters of courage," Miss Marple replied. "You see, I've been thinking about Reverend Hawthorne." Whitcomb's jaw tightened. "Have you?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He was not a brave man in the traditional sense. No battlefield heroics, but he did something quite brave near the end." Whitcomb said nothing. He decided to stop protecting someone, Miss Marple continued, "to stop being silent." Whitcomb's stick paused mid-tap. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Silence can feel like loyalty, can't it? Especially when one owes someone a great deal." Whitcomb looked at her sharply. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at all," Miss Marple replied, merely recalling how difficult it is to confront an old mistake. She moved away before he could respond, leaving discomfort in her wake. Later, Miss Marple sought out Miss Finch. "You did very well," Miss Marple said softly. Miss Finch looked at her in surprise. "At what?" "At remaining quiet," Miss Marple said. "It takes great strength." Miss Finch's lips trembled. "I didn't know what else to do." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "You were taught to endure." Miss Finch's eyes flicked involuntarily toward Colonel Whitcomb. Miss Marple followed her gaze and smiled. The final piece of the game was set that afternoon. Inspector Caldwell announced within earshot of several strategically placed villagers that a breakthrough had been made. The missing letters, he said, were likely hidden near the river, weighted down or concealed. "There will be a search at dawn," he added. "A thorough one." Miss Marple watched Colonel Whitcomb carefully. The effect was immediate. He laughed too loudly. He dismissed the idea as nonsense. And then, far more revealing, he left early. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Caldwell. "You might like to follow him." Caldwell hesitated. "Without evidence." "Evidence," Miss Marple said gently, "is often created by anxiety." Colonel Whitcomb did not go home. He went instead toward the river path. Caldwell followed at a discreet distance, his heart pounding with something dangerously close to hope. Whitcomb moved with surprising speed for a man of his age. He reached the bend in the river where the reeds grew thickest and paused, glancing around. Satisfied he was alone, he stepped into the water's edge and reached beneath a flat stone. Caldwell stepped forward. "That won't be necessary, Colonel." Whitcomb froze. Slowly he straightened, water dripping from his sleeve. His face had lost all pretense of geniality. "You were bluffing," he said. "Yes," Caldwell replied, "but you weren't." The bundle recovered from beneath the stone contained several letters, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Letters written years earlier, documenting a financial arrangement between Colonel Whitcomb and a former parish treasurer, an arrangement that skirted legality and leaned heavily on influence. Reverend Hawthorne had discovered them during routine church record reviews. "He came to me," Whitcomb said later, sitting heavily in Miss Marple's cottage as Caldwell took notes. "He said it had to stop, that the money had to be returned." "And you refused," Caldwell said. "I couldn't," Whitcomb snapped. "It would have ruined me." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "So you arranged to meet him at dawn?" Whitcomb closed his eyes. "I thought I could persuade him." "And when persuasion failed?" Miss Marple asked. His voice was flat. "I struck him. I didn't mean to kill him." "Most people never do," Miss Marple said. Whitcomb bowed his head. Miss Finch. She knew nothing. She only suspected something was wrong. "She protected you anyway," Miss Marple said, "out of loyalty." Whitcomb laughed bitterly. "She always was loyal." The bells, Whitcomb admitted, had been rung in panic. He had hoped the body would be found quickly. Before questions grew dangerous, he had relied on the villagers' hunger for simple explanations. "And you almost succeeded," Caldwell said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "almost." The arrest was quiet. Larkspur End did not gather this time. There were no whispers, no dramatic confrontations. Only a subdued acknowledgement that something deeply uncomfortable had been true all along. That evening Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her embroidery finished at last. The robin perched neatly upon its gate, its eye now correctly stitched. Inspector Caldwell stood beside her. "You played him," he said. "No," Miss Marple replied. "I allowed him to play himself." Outside, the church bells rang for evensong, their sound steady and true. In Larkspur End, the truth had finally been spoken aloud, and silence, at last, was no longer dangerous. Chapter 9. After the bells. Larkspur End did not wake the next morning with relief. Instead, it woke with a peculiar, chastened quiet that follows a long illness, when the danger has passed but the body remembers pain. Curtains were drawn later than usual. Footsteps along the lane were slower, more deliberate. People nodded to one another without speaking, as though conversation itself required reassessment. Miss Marple noticed this with thoughtful sympathy. She was, as always, awake early. The bells had rung for evensong the previous night with their accustomed steadiness, but their sound still seemed to linger in the air, like a truth one could not quite stop hearing. Inspector Caldwell arrived shortly after 9. "It's done," he said simply, removing his hat. "Colonel Whitcomb has been formally charged. He confessed fully." Miss Marple poured him tea. "Confessions are easier when one has already confessed to oneself." Caldwell sat heavily. "The village is in shock." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "They always are. It's much easier to believe in sudden wickedness than in familiar failings." Miss Dora Finch had been cleared entirely. She remained at home, declining visitors, though she sent a short note to Miss Marple that afternoon. "Thank you for seeing clearly when I could not." Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in her workbox. The village reacted in stages. First came disbelief. Colonel Whitcomb, pillar of respectability, decorated veteran benefactor. Surely not. Then came reinterpretation. Old conversations were revisited, past remarks reweighed, small moments suddenly imbued with ominous significance. "He always did like to control things," Mrs. Hardwick said stiffly to anyone who would listen. Yes, Miss Marple thought, and people often mistake control for character. The church council met again, this time in a subdued atmosphere. Mrs. Hardwick presided, but without her former certainty. Decisions were deferred, opinions softened. Reverend Hawthorne's absence was felt more keenly now that his death had acquired meaning. His firmness, once resented, was quietly reappraised. "He was trying to do the right thing," Simon Price said aloud, surprising himself. Miss Marple smiled at him. Doing the right thing is rarely popular at first. Simon flushed but nodded. Inspector Caldwell spent several days completing his report. When it was finished, he allowed himself one final visit to Miss Marple's cottage. "I nearly missed it," he admitted. "If not for you, you would have found it eventually," Miss Marple said kindly. "You were asking questions. You simply needed to ask a few more uncomfortable ones." He shook his head. "You saw it so early?" "No," she replied. "I recognized it." "Recognized it?" "Yes. I once knew a man who believed his good works entitled him to special exemptions. He was shocked when they did not." Caldwell smiled faintly. Human nature again. "It is very repetitive," Miss Marple agreed. The funeral for Reverend Hawthorne was held the following week. The church was full. Even those who had rarely attended came, drawn by a sense of obligation and something close to remorse. Miss Marple sat near the back. The sermon, delivered by a visiting clergyman, spoke of courage, integrity, and the cost of truth. Miss Marple listened carefully. She thought it rather good if slightly idealized. Outside, after the service, people lingered awkwardly. Miss Finch stood apart, pale but composed. Simon hovered near her uncertainly. "He would have forgiven you," Simon said suddenly. Miss Finch looked at him, startled. "I don't know that I deserve it." "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," Miss Marple said gently, joining them. "It's about release." Miss Finch's eyes filled briefly, then steadied. "I will miss him," she said simply. "So will the village," Miss Marple replied. "In time." Life, as it always did, resumed. The harvest festival was eventually held, quieter than usual but sincere. Proceeds were modest. Conversation remained cautious. Yet laughter returned, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The river flowed on, indifferent and unchanged. Miss Marple took her customary walks, observing how the village slowly adjusted its self-image. Colonel Whitcomb's house stood empty now, its windows shuttered. Some spoke of it with anger, others with embarrassment. No one spoke of it lightly. One afternoon, Mrs. Bellamy leaned across the post office counter and said with a faint air of disappointment, "Well, it was all very sordid in the end." Miss Marple considered this. "I'm not sure I agree." Mrs. Bellamy blinked. No, Miss Marple said. "It was rather ordinary." That evening Miss Marple sat by her window, her embroidery set aside. Outside, the village lights blinked on one by one. The bells rang the hour, measured, respectful, unhurried. Inspector Caldwell's parting words returned to her. "You must find it very grim," he had said, "seeing the worst of people." Miss Marple had smiled then as she did now. "Oh no," she murmured. "I see the whole of them. The worst only matters because it so often hides behind the best." She reached for her needle once more, beginning a new piece, a simple pattern, familiar and comforting. Order restored not because the world was suddenly good, but because truth had been allowed its say. In Larkspur End, peace returned. Not the unthinking peace of ignorance, but the quieter, harder peace that follows understanding. And Miss Marple, content once more with observation rather than intervention, stitched carefully on, listening to the bells and to the endlessly instructive murmur of human nature. Chapter 10. The village adjusts time in Larkspur End did what it always did best. It softened edges. Not at once, of course. For several weeks after Colonel Whitcomb's removal, the village behaved like a drawing room after an ill-advised remark, polite, restrained, and acutely aware of itself. People measured their words. Opinions were expressed only after careful glances around. Respectability, having proved unreliable, was handled with caution. Miss Marple observed this phase with patient understanding. She knew it well. Communities, like people, required a period of quiet reorganization after a shock. Beliefs had to be reshelved, certainties examined for cracks. Inspector Caldwell returned briefly to conclude administrative matters. He called on Miss Marple one last time before leaving the district. "You'll be glad to see the end of all this," he said. Miss Marple poured tea. "I never wish things to end," she said, "only to settle." Caldwell smiled ruefully. "You'll be pleased to know the letters will be returned to the diocese, the money too, what remains of it." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Reverend Hawthorne would have liked that." "He would have liked justice," Caldwell agreed. Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. "I think he would have settled for honesty." Caldwell left soon after, and with him went the last official trace of the tragedy. Larkspur End was once more alone with itself. Miss Dora Finch returned gradually to village life. She resumed her walks, her visits to the post office, her quiet participation in church affairs. People treated her with a tentative kindness, unsure how much acknowledgement was appropriate. One afternoon, she stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. "I'm leaving," she said simply. "I've accepted a post elsewhere." Miss Marple nodded. A fresh pattern can be very soothing. Miss Finch hesitated. "Do you think I was foolish?" "For being loyal?" Miss Marple asked. "No. Only human." Miss Finch smiled faintly. "That may be the kindest thing anyone has said to me." Simon Price flourished. With Reverend Hawthorne's successor not yet appointed, Simon took on greater responsibility at the church, ringing the bells with renewed care. "I make sure the knots are right now," he told Miss Marple earnestly. "That's always wise," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Hardwicke, deprived of Colonel Whitcomb's dominating presence, adjusted with visible effort. She remained influential, but her tone softened. Control, she discovered, was less effective when exercised alone. "He fooled us all," she said one morning with stiff regret. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "No, he relied on us fooling ourselves." That realization lingered. The river path was repaired where the reeds had been trampled. The bank grew green again. Children returned to playing nearby, watched carefully at first, then with increasing ease. Life resumed, not exactly as before, but more honestly. One evening, Miss Marple attended evensong. The church was half full, the congregation subdued but sincere. The visiting clergyman spoke briefly, wisely avoiding grand conclusions. Afterward, as Miss Marple stepped out into the cool dusk, she paused by the gate. The bells overhead were still, their silence comfortable now. Reverend Hawthorne, she thought, had been a quiet man who made one decisive, dangerous choice, to stop being silent. It had cost him his life, but it had also restored something else, something fragile and easily lost. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, was not always triumphant. Often it was merely persistent. She walked home slowly, the lane familiar beneath her feet. At her window she paused, looking out at the village she had known for so long. Larkspur End would forget some details. Names would soften, outrage would fade, but something essential would remain. The knowledge that evil did not always arrive loudly, and goodness was not always gentle. Miss Marple sat down, picked up her embroidery and began again. The pattern was simple. The work required patience. Both, she knew, were indispensable. Chapter 11. Threads that Remain. If Larkspur End expected forgetting to arrive quickly, it was disappointed. Forgetting, Miss Marple knew, was not a thing one did. It was a thing that happened gradually, like weathering. Edges softened, not erased. The village had entered that in-between state where the past was no longer raw, but still tender to the touch. Miss Marple found this stage the most revealing of all. People were less guarded now. The urgent need to appear blameless had faded, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous: reflection. She encountered it one morning at the baker's, where Mrs. Bellamy paused amid gossip and frowned. "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "about the Reverend, about how we didn't listen." Miss Marple accepted her loaf. "Listening is tiring," she said gently. "It requires attention." Mrs. Bellamy nodded, unsettled. "I don't like what that says about us." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Most truths are uncomfortable at first." The appointment of a new vicar was announced shortly thereafter. A temporary man, young and earnest, he arrived with careful optimism and a clear understanding that he was stepping into a silence still heavy with meaning. Miss Marple watched him during his first service. He spoke well enough, but what interested her was not his sermon. It was the congregation. They listened more closely now. Words were weighed. Platitudes slid past unheeded. Reverend Hawthorne, she thought, would have approved. Simon Price had taken to spending time in the vestry, carefully reorganising shelves and papers under the new vicar's supervision. One afternoon Miss Marple found him there, dusting the desk with solemn concentration. "It feels wrong," he said abruptly, pretending nothing happened. "It would be wrong," Miss Marple agreed. "Fortunately, no one is pretending." Simon looked relieved. "I still think about that morning." "So do I," Miss Marple said. "But it doesn't frighten me the same way," Simon added. "It makes me careful." Miss Marple regarded him approvingly. Carefulness is a great improvement on fear. Miss Dora Finch's departure approached quietly. There were no farewell gatherings, no speeches. She slipped in and out of the village with characteristic discretion, tying up loose ends. She visited Miss Marple one final time the evening before she left. "I keep wondering," Miss Finch said, standing awkwardly near the door, "whether I should have spoken sooner." Miss Marple considered her carefully. "You spoke when you could. Earlier speech would not necessarily have been heard." Miss Finch nodded. "I don't think Colonel Whitcomb ever imagined he would be capable of such a thing." "Most people don't," Miss Marple replied. "That is why they are." Miss Finch smiled faintly, then grew serious. "You gave him no choice in the end." "No," Miss Marple said. "I gave him an audience." Miss Finch left shortly after, and Larkspur End felt her absence keenly. She had been one of its constants, like the church itself. Quiet, reliable, easily overlooked. Colonel Whitcomb's house was finally sold. The new owners, a couple from London, spoke cheerfully of renovations and fresh starts. The villagers listened politely, unsure what to say. Miss Marple, passing by one afternoon, noticed the garden. "It will need careful pruning," she remarked to the new owner. "Oh, absolutely," the woman said brightly. "We're clearing everything out." Miss Marple smiled to herself. Clearing out was rarely so simple. Inspector Caldwell wrote once more, a brief letter sent from his new posting. "I find myself noticing silences now," it read. "I thought you might appreciate that." Miss Marple did. The final administrative matter, the formal inquest, was concluded without drama. Facts were recited, conclusions reached. The past was officially settled. Unofficially, it lingered. Miss Marple found herself reflecting more often on Reverend Hawthorne, on his firmness at the end, his decision to stop being complicit in silence. She suspected that choice had cost him more than anyone realised. "Courage," she murmured one evening, "is often quiet until it is not allowed to be." The village, for its part, grew slowly more honest with itself. People spoke more carefully, not out of fear, but awareness. Disagreements surfaced earlier. Small grievances were aired rather than buried. It was not a perfect change, but it was real. One afternoon, Mrs. Hardwicke surprised Miss Marple by arriving without an agenda. "I've been thinking," she said stiffly, "about leadership." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" "Yes. I believe I mistook authority for virtue." Miss Marple nodded. "A common error." Mrs. Hardwicke hesitated. "I don't intend to repeat it." Miss Marple smiled. "That is all anyone can promise." As autumn deepened, the church bells rang regularly once more. Their sound had changed subtly, not in tone, but in meaning. They no longer startled, they reminded. Miss Marple listened to them one crisp evening, seated by her window with her embroidery. The pattern beneath her needle was nearly complete, the stitches even and precise. She paused, studying the work. Every design, she reflected, depended as much on what was left unstitched as what was filled in. Too much density ruined the picture. Too much emptiness left it shapeless. Human lives were no different. Larkspur End had learned painfully that silence could conceal rot, and that speaking, however late, could still save something. Miss Marple threaded her needle again. There were always new patterns to begin. Chapter 12. The Quiet Resolution. It was a clear morning when Miss Marple finally allowed herself to think of the matter as finished. Not closed, she had never liked that word, but finished, in the way a piece of needlework was finished. The final stitch placed, the loose threads carefully tucked away, the pattern complete enough to be set aside. Larkspur End lay beneath a thin autumn sun, the kind that warmed without enthusiasm. Smoke rose from chimneys, a dog barked once and stopped. The village had returned unmistakably to itself, though not quite the same self it had been before. Miss Marple walked as she often did toward the church. St. Anselm stood serene again, its stones scrubbed clean by rain and time. Inside, the new vicar was arranging hymn books with earnest precision. He looked up, smiled, and nodded respectfully. Miss Marple returned the gesture and took her usual seat near the back. The service was simple, no grand references to the past, no lingering shadows. The sermon spoke of accountability, not in thunderous tones, but as a natural companion to kindness. Miss Marple approved. Moral lessons, she believed, were most effective when they did not shout. As the final hymn faded, the bells rang, measured even, exactly as they should. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, listening. There had been a time, not so long ago, when the sound of those bells had meant panic, deception, and fear. Now they meant continuity. The distinction mattered. Outside, villagers gathered in small groups, exchanging pleasantries. The awkwardness had mostly gone, not forgotten, but absorbed. Mrs. Bellamy waved from across the green, then hesitated, as if unsure whether gossip was appropriate. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. Life would resume its habits soon enough. Simon Price emerged from the tower, wiping his hands. "They rang true today," he said with quiet pride. "They did," Miss Marple agreed. "You rang them well." Simon shifted his weight. "I keep thinking, if I'd spoken sooner." Miss Marple stopped him gently. "We all think that. It's part of learning." He nodded, thoughtful rather than distressed, and hurried off. Miss Marple turned toward the river path. The water flowed calmly now, its surface broken only by fallen leaves. The place where Reverend Hawthorne's body had been found was indistinguishable from any other bend. Nature, she reflected, was extremely good at forgiveness, though not at memory. She paused, resting her hands on the handle of her handbag. Reverend Hawthorne had been an ordinary man who had made one extraordinary decision. To confront a wrong he could no longer tolerate. He had underestimated, perhaps, the cost of that choice. But Miss Marple believed he had understood it nonetheless. Truth was not gentle. It rarely rewarded those who served it, but it did endure. Later that afternoon, Inspector Caldwell's final letter arrived. "I testified today," it read. "The case is officially concluded. I wanted you to know that your observations were cited more than once, though, of course, without attribution. I suspect that suits you." Miss Marple smiled. It does, she thought. She placed the letter carefully in her drawer and returned to her sitting room. Her embroidery lay where she had left it, nearly complete. She studied it for a long moment before making the final stitch. The picture showed a small village lane, bordered by hedges, with a church spire rising in the distance. It was not ambitious, but it was accurate. Miss Marple preferred accuracy. She tied off the thread, trimmed it neatly, and set the piece aside. Outside, Larkspur End carried on. A cart rattled past. Laughter drifted from somewhere near the green. The village was not redeemed, nor was it ruined. It was simply human. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching the light fade. Her thoughts were calm now, her mind at rest. She had once been asked, by a well-meaning but unimaginative person, whether it troubled her to involve herself in such dark affairs. "It would," she had replied, "if I believed darkness were unusual. What troubled her far more was the ease with which people mistook silence for peace, authority for virtue, and habit for goodness. Those mistakes, she had learned, were far more dangerous than any single crime. In Larkspur End, those mistakes had been exposed, quietly, painfully, but decisively. And that, Miss Marple believed, was enough. The bells rang the hour. She listened, smiling faintly, and reached for a fresh length of thread. There were always new patterns to begin,